The sexual revolution, I think, is two things, okay, that act in combination. The first is an ideological event, right? That you have the radicalism of the 1960s encouraging a rejection of tradition, a rejection of religion, a rejection of all the bourgeois sexual norms of the past. This is not historically unprecedented. It is quite common across history to have periods of licentiousness alternating with periods of prudishness, but generally licentiousness doesn't stick because having sex is probably the most consequential thing a woman can do in a world without contraception, and a lot of women aren't willing to take that risk for the sake of ideology, which is why the second component, which is the technological component, is so important, and that's the pill, of course. Followed soon afterwards by the decriminalization of abortion, because the pill, particularly in its early days, isn't actually that effective. It still isn't 100% effective, and so you need abortion there as a backstop if you're going to pretend that sex is really consequence-free. And of course, all of that is only possible because we're undergoing still an historical event that I think is probably going to be remembered by historians of the future, if we produce any, as something like a second Reformation. So the first Reformation was the rejection of Catholicism. The second Reformation, which we are still experiencing, I would say, is the rejection of Christianity and actually of religion per se. So all of that permits abortion, permits the pill, all of this. And what they do in combination is they act as a sort of acid on the very fragile system of sexual norms that had developed in order to regulate heterosexuality, right? And what a lot of feminists will say at the time, and say still, is that what that regulation actually served to do was to control female sexuality. And they're right, it did. What they tend to forget is that it also acted to control male sexuality, which is actually the more potent and arguably more dangerous force and in need of regulation. And look, I accept that regulation is onerous. I also agree with the sexual revolutionaries who say that chaste monogamy lifelong is not our natural state. It isn't our natural state. Actually, only about 20% of cultures on the anthropological record have been monogamous. We're the unusual ones. Well, we were up until recently. But the thing is that the other 80% are not feminist utopias. They're not matriarchies. Second-wave feminists searched really hard to find evidence of matriarchies on the historical record, and they came up short. What the actual other option seems to be for a complex society like our own is polygamy. So that's when high-status men have lots of wives and low-status men have none. And what you see, actually, now that we've lifted the prohibition on monogamy, is you see that we are tending back towards that human default. So you look at something like dating apps, and you see that high-status men are able to attract basically like digital harems of women. Low-status men are losing out, as we all know, famously. And the thing is about polygamous cultures that they're really bad news for women and children. They have higher rates of domestic abuse, they have higher rates of child abuse, they have higher rates of crime, full stop. And what's more, you end up with this system where actually the men at the very tippy top of the hierarchy have an enormous amount of power to set the terms of the sexual culture. And what I think we're seeing is what I'm going to describe as the homosexualization of heterosexuality. So basically a trend towards seeing greater male preferences in the sexual culture. In the same way that obviously you would expect to see in gay male sexual culture because it's entirely composed of men, right? You're seeing that in the straight dating world as well. So more casual sex, more kind of anonymous sex, more porn, more tolerance for fetishes, all of this stuff. Sex and the City is actually a TV show made by and about gay men. They admit this, Samantha, the horny one, she was based on a real person, a man. The writers have said as much, right? But the problem is that Sex and the City is so emblematic of this idea that having sex like a man and that's what they call it in the first episode, having sex like a man is aspirational. And I've heard from so many women, because they email me all the time, who say that they lent into this. They tried so hard to prioritize sexual freedom, and it made them miserable. Because actually there are profound differences between men and women that I think we'll get onto over the course of the evening. And there's this line from Matthew Arnold that I think about a lot. Freedom is a great horse to ride, but to ride somewhere. Freedom is a good thing in the sense that it enables the good life. But if we can't decide what the good life is? What use is freedom in and of itself? Thank you.